Our final speaker is Dr. Pádraig Óg Ó Ruairc, who holds a PhD from the University of Limerick, who's written extensively on the War of Independence and on the whole revolutionary period. I think he's pioneered in some ways the use not only of archival material but of local memory in a variety of forms, both in relation to County Clare and elsewhere. Some years ago he was involved with Tomás McConmara in the identification of the burial place of a British soldier who'd been killed, I think, in June 1921. And it's interesting that so late, nearly 100 years later, the memory was there of a killing which, you know, at the time do you have a name for that?
Private George Duff Chalmers.
Right, so you got his name as well, but that's a very interesting example of where the local, which might appear to be folklore, very often is enormously important where the archives run out. So I'll hand over to Pádraig now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor O'Halpin. Móríomh agus míle maithagah as 8 mhór golúidear agus caithfidh mé mo buchas a gháil chuig an cartlan míleta as 8 agus cumann sochaí míleta na hÉireann as 8 an churach an caint in Nuamh. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Don't worry, the talk will be in English. What I was asked to cover today was the battle for Limerick. I'm not just talking about Limerick City, which would be the start of it, but I'm going to look at some of the other major events in the other battles in the county towns as well. So just for a bit of background, and we don't have time to go into this properly, but the Civil War almost began in Limerick instead of happening in the forecourts. There was something called the Limerick Crisis in March of 1922. As the British forces were withdrawing from their barracks in what was to become the Free State and going either up to the north or returning back home to England, the arrangement was that they would vacate the barracks and they would hand it over to whatever IRA unit was in the area, regardless of whether they were pro-treaty or the emerging Free State National Army, whatever you want to call them, regardless of whether they were pro-treaty on that side or anti-treaty, just give it to the local IRA groups. Now, Limerick City at this time was held by the IRA brigade in the area would have been the Mid-Limerick Brigade. Not a very effective brigade during the War of Independence. It was actually riven by infighting, and in one internecine killing, they actually shot one of their intelligence officers, alleging he was a spy, and he's the only case, Dalton, actually an All-Ireland medal winner in football, he's the only case where Dáil Éireann came out and said this guy was shot as a spy. He definitely was not. So they're not the most effective military unit, and what happens is that the Free State Army and the Free State government ordered the East Clare Brigade, who had gone pro-treaty under Michael Brennan, later to become the longest-serving Chief of Staff of the Irish Army. They had been ordered to do a deal with the British that when the British evacuated their barracks, they would be told and the pro-treaty side would be able to come in. So this was a breach of the agreement, and that breach was done. It hadn't happened anywhere else, but it happened in Limerick because Limerick was regarded as being central to the control of Munster. So the British Army regiments march out. The local Mid-Limerick Brigade, anti-treaty IRA, are taken completely by surprise, and the 4 main barracks in Limerick City are all handed over to the pro-treaty side. This creates a crisis because the anti-treaty side are ready to attack them, and into Limerick start flooding very experienced IRA troops, particularly from Cork, Tipperary and from Kerry. And even troops come from as far away as Dublin, and for about 2 weeks it looks as if the first shots of the Civil War are going to be fired in Limerick. But eventually the pro-treaty side, the Free State Army, stand down, and it basically narrowly averts the outbreak of the fighting. There is actually fighting in the Civil War in Kilkenny in May of 22, but of course it doesn't formally start until June. You can see here 2 recently arrived recruits, I think, from the Cork anti-treaty IRA wielding a Lewis gun. So, if we take the formal start of the Civil War, 28th of June 1922, this is the military situation in Limerick. You have the 4 main barracks. You have the Strand Barracks up on top, what today is called King John's Castle, but was the Castle Barracks. The new barracks, as it was called, today known as Sarsfield Barracks, and the artillery barracks, or the ordnance barracks that was destroyed, hasn't been used since. So those were the 4 main military barracks held by the anti-treaty IRA. They had also taken over, in the earlier standoff with the Free State side, they had taken over some hotels, the Glentworth Hotel, and they had taken over some of the RIC barracks. but other RIC barracks in the town, they actually left vacant, like the William Street barracks. So when the fighting begins in Dublin, there are no pro-treaty Free State Army in Limerick City at all. But they come in under cover of nightfall when they hear what's happened in Dublin. So now the situation is reversed. The anti-treaty side hold all the barracks, and the pro-treaty side come in, and under cover of nightfall, Michael Brennan manages to sneak several hundred men into the city and to start occupying buildings. And I suppose the best things they managed to get hold of were the police barracks, which just had caretakers from the Board of Works minding them. The anti-treaty IRA had neglected to garrison them. They also take over a number of churches and use their steeples basically as gun positions. And if you look at where they've set up, the blue area indicating the Free State side, they're actually controlling the centre of town. They're taking over cafes, banks, civilian shops, and they've really driven a wedge without firing a shot between the different anti-treaty units which are isolated. For example, when the fighting begins, the Strand Barracks and the Castle Barracks, which look very close to each other, they couldn't communicate except by heliograph because you have the Shannon River flowing down in between, and attempting to cross the bridge was very perilous. So the Free State Army get into Limerick City, but fighting does not break out immediately on the 29th of June. What happens is the two sides are still in a standoff. Remember, there were different factions of the IRA. There was thought that the conflict initially could be restricted to Dublin, but this is what was happening in the city. Both sides were going, kind of standing off, building barricades, claiming territory, but no fighting had broken out. So this is Patrick Street in Limerick, and again, a line of sandbags, and behind this they actually dug down into the street level and got some trenches, commandeering vehicles again, using them as part of their barricades. I love this improvised barricade. It would be worth the Defence Forces sometime doing a study of how effective sods of turf are at stopping 303 bullets. Now, another thing I love about this barricade is the Free State soldiers who are manning it. For those of you into weaponry, look at the guns. 3 of them have Lee Enfield 303s. One of them is shooting, the second guy in, is shooting what looks to be a Birmingham Small Arms 1908 2.2 rifle. This is the kind of thing a Boy Scout would have been training with in England. So Brennan's side is actually quite short of arms, and we'll come to that in a minute. Brennan is the Free State leader. This is on a place where the Free State troops set up a barricade on the outside of the city on the Charleville Road. Note the graffiti on the barricade, GA fans, Hill 60. Can you see it written here? It hadn't been renamed Hill 16 yet. So what you have in the treaty already, in the city already, holding the main military, purpose-built military barracks are 700 anti-treaty IRA volunteers. So you're talking about local men from Limerick who, as I said, would not have been the most active, that particular Limerick unit during the War of Independence, but very experienced IRA veterans from Cork, particularly from the 3rd West Cork Brigade, were in Limerick City as well. And they were facing off against 400 Free State soldiers. Now, the East Clare Brigade and Michael Brennan, who went pro-treaty, they would have been one of the most experienced and successful flying columns anywhere in Ireland during the War of Independence. So he has a good deal of military experience. He was also in charge of Galway and what was the 1st Western Division. He has appealed for recruits, and most of the recruits he gets seems to be very raw recruits. There's later complaints about their lack of knowledge and discipline, etc. Brennan, again, no fighting breaks out for the first few days. Brennan needs to keep, even though he's in a very weak position, he needs to keep the anti-treaty IRA at bay. So he uses what I describe as beau geste tactics. He doesn't have a lot of guns. He has about 400 troops, but he only has 150 rifles. So what he does is he takes 50 of the rifles and he sends them up to Ennis. They're given to a group of Free State soldiers who march in with those rifles. They're then taken off and those soldiers are disarmed. They're sent back out, and he keeps shipping the rifles out of the city to different train stations. So basically, anti-treaty IRA intelligence keeps going. Another 50 have come in with rifles, another 50, another 50. And basically, he's creating the illusion that Free State troops are constantly pouring in with more arms. Brennan does things like he gets drain pipes. He orders them to be dismantled at night, and he shoves them out windows to give the appearance appearance of a Lewis gun from across the street. And he's very clever in doing this. And why he's doing that, he's biding time. He's waiting for reinforcements in Dublin when the fighting finishes, because he knows if there's a fight, he's going to lose. So what happens is he buys time by negotiating with Liam Lynch. This is Michael Brennan, and this was his quote on it. The holding of Limerick was key to the holding of the whole south and west. My whole fright was that Lynch would attack me before the guns turned up, because we couldn't last. I had to keep him talking to keep him from attacking. We met and met altogether about a dozen times. We used to meet in the presbytery of the Augustinian Church, where we argued and argued and argued. And Liam Lynch's hope is, if he can keep Michael Brennan neutral, or keep him out of the conflict, or keep him from attacking, or make some sort of arrangement with him, that will give Lynch control of Munster, undisputed, and then he can march on Dublin. Of course, that's Lynch's thinking. Brennan has other ideas. Now, I mentioned this story, this one particular pro-treaty soldier, Jack Monday. There's an excellent article on him, which was written by Sam McGrath, who's here working in the military archives. It's up on the pension blog. I'll tell you his story in a minute. He was actually from Ghana, and he was fighting in the Free State Army. And I mention this because I was listening a few years ago to a radio interview, and there was this diversity drive by the Defence Forces, and they were talking about more women in the Defence Forces, and they had, I don't know, was she a recent cadet, or was she one of the earliest women who had served in the modern army? And she said in the interview, women have been involved. We've a very long history in the Defence Forces. You know, we've been recruiting women into the Defence Forces from the 1980s. And then my car reception cut out, because every single Cumann woman, every Citizen Army woman, and every woman who was in the IRA turned in their graves, you know. So I mentioned that anecdote just because Jack Monday, I would argue, was the first person of colour to fight in the Defence Forces. And his story is, one of the places that the Free State Army take over when they come into Limerick City, they need large, stone-built, easily defended buildings to take over, because they don't have the barracks. So one of the places they take is Limerick Jail. And they go from cell to cell, checking on all the prisoners and what they're in for. And they slide back one of the cell, peepholes, and they see this guy from Ghana sitting in a cell. And they say, who are you? What are you in for? He says, I'm Jack Monday. And the story is he was in for stabbing 2 black and tans. Apparently there was a tradition in the merchant navy, when you left the country, you flew its flag as a symbol of goodbye. These guys were leaving Limerick during the truce, and they flew before the British evacuation. They flew the tricolour. They were boarded by black and tans, and a knife fight breaks out, and Jack Monday, fair play to him, could hold his own. He stabbed 2 tans. The British evacuate. They forget about him. The Free State take over, and they say to him, look, you're free to go, but you're somewhat of an oddity in Limerick. We can't just have you wandering the streets. What did you do on board the ship? He said, I was an engineer. Perfect, we're looking for engineers. So he actually enlisted in the Free State Army, changed his name, Gaelicised it to Irish, Joseph de Loon, and was later transferred to Clonmel, where he, I think, retired from the army in 1927. And when I brought out my book on the battle for Limerick City, a coffee house had just opened in town, and somebody was reading it and said that would be a perfect name for the coffee house. So there it is, Jack Mondays. So if someone from the Defence Forces press department is on, and it'd be great if there is a diversity drive in the Defence Forces, but I want Jack Monday mentioned, or you'll hear from me. Just another casualty, or Jack Monday survives, obviously. One casualty I'll mention in particular is this guy, Fianna Éireann scout Michael Moynihan. Now, we tend to think of Fianna Éireann scouts being pretty young. This guy was actually 19 years old. He was on dispatch duty, and he was killed looking out a window, lifting back a blanket. And again, the military people here will know better than I, but the IRA, because of a lack of sandbags, which Liz mentioned, they started hanging up blankets inside the windows, and they'd have lines of 2 or 3 blankets. And the theory was that if a bullet came in through the window, that as it hit each blanket, it would lose its force, and that's a way of bulletproofing it. And as Fianna Éireann scout Michael Moynihan delivered a dispatch to the guys in the buildings, wasn't obviously involved in the frontline fighting himself, wanted to see what was happening, drew back the blanket, and someone on the pro-treaty side shot him. The real fighting in Limerick City, when it does happen, it starts on the 11th of July, 1922. So about 2 weeks into the Civil War proper. and military reinforcements arrive from Dublin. This is the garrison of one of the key positions in that fighting, the Strand Barracks. And the guy seated, smiling on the right-hand side is their commanding officer. He's Commandant Mackey. I think he's Cornelius Mackey. And when he was called upon to surrender when the fighting began by the pro-treaty side, he said, "I won't surrender while I have ammo." And when the fighting breaks out, initially, it's very haphazard in the city. You know, they're attacking each other, they're claiming a house, they're tunnelling through walls. The other side loses a cafe. The anti-treaty IRA builds its own armoured cars from scrap. They come up with crazy ideas like getting an agricultural sprayer, filling it with paraffin and trying to use it to burn out pro-treaty barracks. And again, none of these things are successful. But this is the building. The last photograph I showed you was of the Strand Barracks, which is actually an apartment complex today, but the fabric of the building survives. These are the buildings next to it. And just to show you the intensity of the fighting in Limerick, these are domestic houses, remember. You might see the bullet holes up there in between the two windows on the top floor. That's a close-up of it. That, to me, rivals anything that you'll see in Dublin on the GPO or the forecourts in terms of bullet damage. So the fighting, as I said, breaks out in Limerick City. It's initially, very haphazard. Really, no side gets any big advantage. There are very few casualties until the artillery arrives down from Dublin. And that happens, I think, around the 19th or 20th the fighting begins on the 11th and the artillery arrives on the 19th, 20th. Now, when they're firing at the again, this is the barracks I showed you, the Strand Barracks, which is right on the riverfront. Remember, these big 18-pound artillery guns are meant for firing miles and miles away. They're not for the distance of the River Shannon, which is about 500 yards. So apparently the pro-treaty artillery men were literally just lowering the barrel of the gun, opening, is it the breech you call it, and just looking down the barrel to sight the building they're shooting at 600 yards or 500 yards away. And it does tremendous damage to the Strand Barracks. And there have been several assaults, using armoured cars, machine guns, Thompson machine guns were being fired into the barracks that the Free State had. There were guys inside with a Vickers gun inside firing back out, and no 5 or 6 assaults were fended off on this building until the artillery comes. And then Connie Mackey, who had said, "I won't surrender while I have ammo," his position is being blown to pieces. He has no other choice. And once the Strand Barracks, it's the only one that's captured in the fighting, once that falls, the IRA decide, right, we're evacuating Limerick. And they burn all their barracks. That's the Castle Barracks. It's taken from where the Strand Barracks is at the time. And you can see that all the buildings go up in flame immediately. And within minutes, the new barracks in Limerick, what's now Sarsfield Barracks, and the Ordnance Barracks, they go up in flame as well. So when the pro-treaty side or the Free State Army actually takes Sarsfield Barracks, that is what it looked like at the time. It was a burnt-out shell. So they continued to use the RIC barracks they had held as their headquarters. And this is Cork IRA leader Tom Kelleher, who would have been involved in things like the Upton ambush. He'd be one of, I suppose, Tom Barry and Liam Deasy's deputies. And he says, quote, "We were in a tight situation and in the end, we had no chance against them. Retreat became inevitable, and when it came, it resembled a stampede. We fell back through Adair, finally ending up in Buttevant. We felt hopelessly disillusioned and disheartened. The whole flaming struggle seemed to be leading nowhere." So these are the fatalities in Limerick City: 11 civilians, 6 Free State soldiers, 6 IRA volunteers, and 1 Fianna Éireann scout. These guys on the right here are the 3 Free State generals who basically win the battle in Limerick City. On the furthest right is Michael Brennan, who I've mentioned previously. Standing in the centre, the guy with the moustache, is General W.R.E. Murphy, who will be very important when we talk about the battle for Kilmallock. And then you've Owen O'Duffy beside him. What I find very interesting is that both O'Duffy and Brennan are in the new Free State Army uniform. W.R.E. Murphy is wearing the IRA uniform from the War of Independence, even though he had never been in the IRA in the War of Independence. The other thing you'll notice, if you look carefully, O'Duffy has his left hand down by his side. He's missing his left middle index finger. O'Duffy shot it off while drunk, but of course later he always told people he lost it in a gun battle with the Black and Tans. So the battle for Kilmallock. So as soon as Limerick City falls, the IRA withdraws in all sorts of directions. As Tom Kelleher said when they retreated, it was more like a stampede. And here we can see an action shot from the fighting, and it appears to be Free State soldiers tending someone. I'm not sure, is he an enemy combatant or he's one of their own? We've just seen that the uniforms weren't standard at the time. So the big question is, why Kilmallock? Well, the IRA, the main body of them, they retreat both south and west. The main body of them is retreating towards Cork, and Kilmallock is the first large town en route. The other thing, if you know Kilmallock town, is it's down in a valley and it's surrounded by hills. So the IRA had the idea if they controlled the high ground around Kilmallock, it would be very easy to defend the town. General W.R.E. Murphy, who I mentioned, is the guy in charge of this, and he had been in the British Army in the First World War, and that tells because it's the only place where there was trench fighting in the Civil War. As soon as they arrive around Kilmallock, they surround the IRA positions and they actually start building and constructing trenches and digging in using First World War tactics. So that, from the Atlas of the Revolution, UCC, is gives you an idea of the different positions. The IRA in red holding the town, and the Free State side basically surrounding it. So what happens in Kilmallock is really there's a lot of fighting in the fields outside the town, and it's the IRA trying to maintain their position and hold the Free State side back. But basically their morale collapses and panic sets in. What happens is on the 2nd of August, there's the Kerry landings in Feenet. And a lot of the IRA volunteers on the anti-treaty side in Kilmallock are from Kerry. So they get news of this, and they basically abandon their posts and go back to fight in their home areas. A day or two later, when news of what's happened in Kerry has spread even further and that the Free State Army have gained a foothold there, the anti-treaty IRA volunteers from Cork figure this is going to happen down south as well. And they abandon their positions and head back to their home places. So when the actual fighting ends, there's only local IRA volunteers still staying in Kilmallock, and the Free State Army basically start using their artillery on the 4th of August to shell the town and that IRA garrison. Again, they have no defence. They have nothing capable of meeting or stopping this artillery despite their fighting resolve. And when the Free State Army roll into Kilmallock, there actually is no one there to try and stop their advance. All the positions are abandoned. And this is recently found film footage from the IFI. You can actually see it of the field guns in use. The fatalities in Kilmallock: 7 Free State soldiers, 6 IRA volunteers, 1 civilian. Both John O'Callaghan, who wrote the book on Kilmallock, and I had come across accounts previously whereby it looked as if in 1 or 2 instances Free State soldiers may have been taken and summarily executed. But when you look at the pension files related to them, it doesn't bear that out. So I think both of us have changed our position on that. So fighting in Adair we'll look at very briefly. 4th of August 1922, so this is Kilmallock is to the south of Limerick, this is the Free State Army advancing west. That's actually how they transported their artillery gun. The Free State Army had taken control of Cleve's condensed milk factory, and they commandeered one of its steam trucks and used it to drive the artillery gun out because they didn't have horses or whatever is normally used. And again, it's the same story. The IRA and the town are very determined, but once the artillery arrives, it's over within a matter of hours. There is 1 fatality in Adair, and it's this lady, Miss Margaret Hartney, who was coming them on. Again, very long tradition of women being in the front line in this period. And the Free State Army had a bulletin, Limerick War News, or Scéal Catha Limni, and it gives this report of the fighting. She was in the Dunraven Arms Hotel, which is still there. That was the IRA's, anti-treaty IRA's first aid post. And it said, the Free State report was, quote, all the rooms in the building were found to be bespattered with blood, showing there must have been fairly severe casualties amongst the irregulars. There's only 1 fatality, and that's Margaret Hartney. And it appears she just got blown to atoms by a direct hit from a shell. So coming on, fatalities in the War of Independence period, 1918 to 21, just 2. Coming on, fatalities in the Civil War period, including Margaret Hartney, are actually double that, are 4. So women were playing an even closer role to the front line in the Civil War. So just to finish up, because I'm just coming up in 25 minutes, Newcastle West. 7th of August 1922, it's the last major town in Limerick, and that's what they're fighting for. That's actually my workplace with the Office of Public Works. My office is in there. It's open as a tourist site, and that is the Desmond Castle. It had previously been occupied by the Warwickshire Regiment during the War of Independence, and then was taken over by the anti-treaty IRA. So when the Free State Army arrived, there's two brothers in there amongst the garrison from Limerick City. First of them was IRA volunteer Edward O'Dwyer. These are the only two fatalities of that fighting. He goes north to where the Free State are setting up their artillery guns, and he's sniping at them, trying to prevent them getting the guns in position, and he's actually hit and killed. And what you see here on the left is, I would argue, the very earliest Civil War memorial. This is flat down in the ground. It was constructed about a month after volunteer Edward O'Dwyer was killed, and it was a local butcher who dug out the shape of a cross in the ground, poured concrete into it, broke apart his rosary beads. You can see the crucifix from it there, and perhaps you can see here the letters spelled out R.I.P., and up higher is the name Edward O'Dwyer. So that's got to be the oldest, I would argue, Civil War memorial in the country. His brother, IRA volunteer Dennis O'Dwyer, is killed after the shelling begins. Edward O'Dwyer's unit obviously fails. The castle is shelled. Part of it is destroyed. The Republicans burn the other half before retreating south. And during that retreat, Dennis O'Dwyer is killed. Now, the memorial, which is a modern one, simply says killed tragically on 7th of August 1922. But again, this is the value of having the pension statements. And this is his sister, Catherine O'Connell, claiming. There you have the two brothers, the one memorial card. And she says, quote, "At Newcastle, West Limerick, on the 7th of August 1922, my brother Edward O'Dwyer was killed in action. My brother Dennis was murdered after being taken prisoner. He was put up against the wall and his body was riddled with machine gun fire." Now, again, if you were making this up for propaganda, you would say that both the brothers were killed, but she's very specific. It's only the second one. And I mentioned this, look at the date, 7th of August 1922, because there's still this myth that, oh, the fighting in the Civil War didn't get really bad. There weren't atrocities until long after Michael Collins is killed. No. There's evidence of it much earlier. So, to sum it up, Liam Lynch says to Ernie O'Malley, the agreement reached at Limerick, this is his negotiations with Brennan, was broken by the enemy. I believe we will eventually have to destroy all our posts and have to operate as of old in flying columns. And finally, if you want to read more about it, I highly recommend John O'Callaghan's book, The Battle for Kilmallock, which is the second best book you can buy in the Civil War in Limerick. There's also my own book. Thank you very much. Mille Margaret.